I was 16 when I first heard my parents mention a fund for my college education. We were sitting at the worn-out dining table, the fading sunlight streaming through the dusty curtains, and my mother gently tapped a thick envelope. She said, "We're setting this aside for you," with a proud tilt of her chin. My father nodded in agreement, explaining that every paycheck would contribute. I believed them completely, never imagining they could break that promise. I took for granted that my future was safe, that I had time to plan. In retrospect, I see how naive I was. I should have noticed the small inconsistencies, the uneasy silences whenever money came up. But back then, I just smiled and thanked them, convinced that my parents cared about my dreams as much as I did. I had no clue about the disaster that awaited me a few years down the road. My mother wasn't overly affectionate, but she had a habit of calling me my big dreamer. I was always scribbling articles and opinions for my high school paper, certain I'd become a journalist one day. It felt like everything was lining up. My parents promised I'd have enough to at least start college without crippling debt. Yes, we were a modest, middle-class family, and yes, we had to tighten our belts to contribute, but I trusted them. My older sister, Marianne, was less academically inclined. She drifted through part-time jobs, waitressing, babysitting, working at a boutique, but she never stuck to anything for long. I didn't begrudge her that. We simply had different goals. I was content focusing on my studies while she dreamed about running a business, though she never specified what kind. Looking back, there might have been subtle envy in her eyes when she heard our parents praise my academic efforts. I thought nothing of it. Everything changed the summer before my senior year. I just finished a volunteer internship at a local newspaper and was buzzing with anticipation for my final year of high school. I wanted to pad my resume with more writing samples, maybe pitch a few small magazines. One evening, I noticed Marianne sitting in the living room, scrawling numbers in a spiral notebook. She looked up as I walked in, gave me a tight smile, and quickly flipped the cover shut. I found it odd, but she'd always been secretive about her projects. My father, seated nearby, coughed uncomfortably. My mother was in the kitchen, avoiding our gaze. I sensed tension, a disturbance in the usual hum of our household, yet nobody said a word to me. The air felt heavy, but I shrugged it off, deciding it was probably just one of Marianne's passing whims. Little did I know it was the start of something bigger. I was never the kind of person who suspected my own family could betray me. Growing up, I always believed that blood was thicker than water and that my parents had my best interests at heart. We weren't wealthy, but my parents claimed they were setting aside a small college fund for me so I could study journalism, which was my lifelong dream. My sister Marianne was 4 years older, bright and ambitious in her own right, but in a different way. She never cared about formal education. Instead, she was fascinated by the idea of becoming her own boss. Our parents always doted on her spirited nature. In contrast, I'd watch from the sidelines, quietly absorbing everything and waiting for my own chance. I distinctly remember the day I found out my college fund was gone. My body went cold, as if the entire world collapsed around me. It happened on a Sunday afternoon right after church. My mother let slip that I might need to start looking for scholarships. I stared at her, confused. We had discussed how my college fund, although modest, would cover a big portion of tuition, and I could work part-time for living expenses. That was the plan for years. When I pushed back, she shifted nervously. My father chimed in with a shrug, as if his part in this fiasco could be excused so easily. Marianne, next to him, stared at the floor. She wouldn't even meet my eyes. That was my first clue that something deeper was at play. My stomach churned as I demanded an explanation. My mother cleared her throat, glancing at Marianne, and admitted the money had been reallocated to fund my sister's new bakery venture. I felt my heart sink. Everything I believed in was now broken. My first instinct was to run outside and scream, but I forced myself to remain in the living room, inhaling. In my head, I replayed all the clues I had missed. Over the past few months, Marianne had boasted about this dream of hers, but she never mentioned how she planned to finance it. I wondered if my parents had started slipping her bits of my fund long before I found out. The betrayal was colossal. My own dreams of attending the journalism program at the local university felt like a child's fantasy. I demanded they return whatever was left. My father stared at me, looking miserable, and mumbled that it was all gone. They'd invested every cent into the bakery, which had opened 3 weeks ago, but was already losing money. I had never felt such a searing combination of anger and heartbreak in my life. I wanted revenge. I didn't speak to my parents for the rest of that day. Instead, I locked myself in my room and tried to figure out how to salvage my future. Without the college fund, I had zero chance of paying for my freshman year. No matter how many part-time jobs I took, I'd never accumulate that much in time for the upcoming semester. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle of the matter, the sense that my life had been deemed less important than Marianne's risky dream. I felt like a second-class member of the family. When I finally emerged for dinner, no one had the courage to meet my gaze. Marianne mumbled something about not meaning to hurt me. I said nothing, but the stony silence that followed expressed my fury. I felt my entire world shift, as though the foundation of our family had irreparably cracked, completely. That night, I researched scholarships and grants until my eyes burned. I discovered a handful of opportunities, but they were competitive. The deadlines loomed close, and I had to scramble to gather recommendations and essays. Still, I refused to give up. My fury propelled me forward like a rocket. Every time I felt doubt creep in, I pictured Marianne happily pouring my tuition into her bakery's cash register, and my anger reignited. My parents tried to talk to me about it the following morning, offering apologies that felt like empty gestures. They didn't understand how deeply they had wronged me. My father muttered something about supporting the family's best prospects, and I almost lost it. My mother, wringing her hands, insisted that they had fully intended to pay me back somehow, but I knew it was too late for that. They'd already chosen sides, and I wasn't one of them. Marianne's bakery was a disaster from the start. She had no real experience, no solid business plan, and our parents' life savings evaporated. Within a month, she was barely making enough to cover rent. She began hinting that she needed more money to keep it going, but our parents had nothing left to give. I watched their guilt grow, like a dark cloud hovering over the house. It might have satisfied me to see them suffer if it hadn't affected my future so directly. I wrestled with the bitterness in my heart. I couldn't allow myself to pity them. They had made a choice, and I was determined to repay them with silence and emotional distance. Meanwhile, I balanced 2 part-time jobs at the grocery store and the library, trying to save a fraction of what I needed for tuition. It was an exhausting, soul-draining process that left me numb. I clung to a sliver of hope that I'd earn a scholarship. The day the admissions letter arrived, my hands trembled as I tore open the envelope. I had been accepted into the journalism program, but with only a partial grant. It covered some tuition, but not nearly enough. My relief mingled with despair. That evening, my mother tried to congratulate me, but the joy in her eyes seemed forced. I couldn't help noticing how Marianne avoided me altogether. Perhaps she sensed my hostility. Despite everything, I tried to ignore the resentment that threatened to consume me. I kept telling myself that hard work would pay off, yet deep down, I knew I was furious at my entire family for what they'd done. Late at night, I found myself plotting ways to break free from their hold. The only thing fueling me was the thought of eventually getting my revenge. My revenge wasn't going to be impulsive or violent. I was too rational for that. Instead, I planned to do it in a way that exposed their betrayal and forced them to confront their actions. I began documenting everything. I kept screenshots of every message that mentioned my education fund. I photocopied bank records showing my parents' withdrawals. Late at night, I'd sift through these papers, feeling a grim satisfaction. Meanwhile, I continued applying for jobs and internships, hoping to patch together enough funds to stay in school. My father had the nerve to suggest I move back home and commute, but I shot that idea down immediately. The last place I wanted to be was under their roof. I decided I'd move in with a friend who lived closer to campus. Even though it meant couch surfing for a while, I felt an urgent need to escape their grasp. By August, I had scraped together enough grants, scholarships, and wages to start my freshman year. My parents sent a few $100s for books, probably trying to ease their consciences. I accepted the money, but didn't thank them. Marianne's bakery, meanwhile, seemed on the verge of closing. She was behind on every bill, and rumors circulated that she'd borrowed money from various relatives, none of whom expected to be repaid. Part of me felt satisfied that her poor decisions had consequences, but another part worried about how deeply my family was sinking. I had to remind myself that this was their problem, not mine. My focus was on building my own life, separate from their mistakes. Once classes started, I immersed myself in campus activities, forging new friendships, and working part-time in the library. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. My desire for revenge simmered quietly. As the semester progressed, I found a rhythm. My schedule was hectic, but I managed to juggle classes, study sessions, and work. Late nights, I returned to my friend's cramped living room, where I slept on a fold-out couch. It wasn't ideal, yet it was far better than living under my parents' disappointed stares. I rarely spoke to them, ignoring their occasional calls and responding to texts with brief, curt messages. Whenever I felt guilt or nostalgia, I reminded myself of the massive betrayal. My sister tried to reach out once, leaving a voicemail apologizing for everything. Her voice quivered with regret, but I deleted it immediately. I told myself she didn't deserve my compassion. My single-minded focus was on securing my future. Meanwhile, I continued compiling evidence of how they'd mishandled my money. I didn't know exactly how I'd use it, but I knew I wanted them exposed, thoroughly. Near the end of first semester, I visited home briefly to grab some winter clothes. The house felt different, as though an invisible weight pressed down on everything. My mother hovered, asking if I'd stay for dinner. I declined, citing a study group. I sensed her relief that I wasn't causing a scene, but also her sadness at our fractured relationship. My father seemed eager to avoid me altogether, muttering a quick greeting before disappearing into the garage. Marianne wasn't even there. I heard she had finally closed the bakery and was working part-time at a diner. I felt no pity. As I rummaged through my old room, I found an envelope containing receipts and official bank statements. They were from the months when my parents first started pulling money out for Marianne's bakery. I slipped them into my backpack, aware that this evidence could be useful someday. Or sooner. That winter break, I stayed mostly on campus, working longer shifts at the library. Snow blanketed the city, and I found solace in the quiet halls where few students wandered. My parents sent a text inviting me home for Christmas, but I ignored it. The pain was still too raw, and I had nothing to celebrate with them. I spent Christmas Day in my friend's apartment, eating pizza and watching old movies. Oddly enough, it was the most peaceful holiday I'd had in years. Without the tension of forced family cheer, I could breathe. I used that time to prepare for finals and also to refine my revenge plan. Bit by bit, I sorted my evidence into a digital folder. Whenever doubt crept in, I reminded myself that they had stolen my future. I owed them nothing but retribution. In my mind, I heard their excuses and I scoffed, quietly. When spring semester arrived, I realized I needed to solidify my plan. Merely collecting documents wouldn't satisfy me. I wanted to confront them in a way that left no doubt about their wrongdoing. I thought about hiring a lawyer, but I didn't have the funds. Besides, a lawsuit would likely drag on for years. Then I had another idea. I could expose their actions publicly. Granted, it was risky and could damage our family's reputation in the community, but why should I protect them when they hadn't protected me? I discussed it in vague terms with a trusted professor who taught media ethics. She cautioned me against making any moves that could harm my own credibility. I listened, but my anger burned too hot for restraint. I decided that once I had my foot in the door of the journalism world, I'd publish a scathing piece about their betrayal. Soon, summer arrived faster than I expected. I was fortunate to land an internship at a local news station, which paid a small stipend. It was enough to move into a cheap studio apartment near campus. Though cramped, it felt like a personal victory. I no longer had to rely on friends for a couch to sleep on. My parents sent an occasional text asking if I needed anything. Each time, I felt a bitter sting of irony. They'd already taken what I needed most. Marianne tried to reach me again, this time sending a handwritten letter. It apologized for taking money that was never hers. She wrote that she missed me, that she was desperate to fix things. I read it once, then tore it up. My revenge wouldn't allow for reconciliation. I wasn't interested in mending bridges that should have never been burned in the first place. Not ever. Working at the news station was enlightening. I learned how to verify sources, conduct interviews, and handle sensitive information. My supervisor, a seasoned journalist, stressed the importance of ethical storytelling. Part of me felt a pang of guilt every time she mentioned integrity because I was plotting a very personal expose. Still, I kept my eyes on the goal. My final project for the internship involved pitching a potential news story. While most interns chose feel-good local pieces, I decided to pitch an investigative article about families who misuse education funds. It was an indirect approach, but I wanted to gauge my supervisor's reaction. She found it compelling but reminded me to gather evidence carefully. I smirked privately. Evidence was something I had in abundance. Over several weeks, I honed my pitch, refining the angle. Deep inside, I felt a grim excitement build. My time for payback had come. Finally, I returned home that weekend to gather a few more personal items and, more importantly, to finalize my evidence. My parents seemed surprised to see me, and for a brief moment, my mother's eyes lit with hope. I kept my demeanor calm but distant. Marianne was there, sitting awkwardly on the couch. Tension crackled in the air as soon as I entered. My father cleared his throat, asked me how school was going, and I gave short, polite answers. I refused to engage in the usual small talk. Then I announced I needed access to some old documents. My mother offered to help me look, but I declined. I went straight to the attic, where I rummaged through boxes until I found the last pieces of proof, signed letters, old passbooks, everything confirming their betrayal. Before I left, Marianne approached me, tears in her eyes, but I brushed right past her. When I submitted my investigative pitch at the station, my supervisor was intrigued. She wanted to know if I had specific interviews lined up. I hesitated, then told her I could secure testimonies from individuals who had personally experienced stolen education funds. That was true enough. My own experience was the backbone. But I also had a few other acquaintances who had faced similar betrayals. I reached out to them discreetly, gathering quotes and verifying details. The more I dug, the more outraged I became. Stories of parents and siblings exploiting college funds were alarmingly common. My supervisor approved my initial draft, praising its emotional depth. She urged me to handle it delicately, not realizing I was the central victim. I poured my rage and heartbreak into every paragraph. With each keystroke, I felt closer to exposing my parents. Perhaps I was driven by revenge, but I didn't care. Not anymore. Finally, the story was set to air on the station's website. I had changed names and certain details to protect myself legally. Still, anyone from my hometown with half a brain would recognize the parallels. My stomach twisted the night before publication. I questioned whether I was ready for the fallout. Then I remembered how they stole my dreams, and my resolve hardened. The piece went live on a Wednesday morning. Within hours, it had garnered surprising attention. The station's social media lit up with comments from people sharing similar stories. My phone vibrated constantly with incoming calls, though I ignored most of them. Then an unfamiliar number appeared. I answered out of curiosity. It was my mother, her voice shaking. She had seen the article. She begged me to take it down, insisting it would ruin the family's name. I told her she should have thought of that before. The backlash hit my parents swiftly. Neighbors speculated about who the article was referencing, and soon enough, whispers identified them as the culprits. My sister, who had been trying to rebuild her life, found herself shadowed by shame. She called me in tears, begging me to clarify things. I refused. I told her that actions have consequences, and she was finally tasting hers. Meanwhile, my piece was hailed by the station as a courageous expose highlighting a widespread issue. They offered me a chance to expand it into a longer documentary segment, which I eagerly accepted. For the first time, I felt a sense of justice. I had taken control of my narrative. My parents continued to call, leaving voicemail after voicemail, each more desperate than the last. I listened to them only to confirm that their regret was real. But forgiveness was off the table. I wanted them ruined. In the end, the bakery failure was the least of their worries. My article gained traction, prompting deeper discussions about financial betrayal within families. I received messages from strangers thanking me for shedding light on their own experiences. With each note, my resentment eased a fraction, replaced by purpose. I graduated from my program with honors, securing a position at the station. I spotted my parents in the crowd, tears in their eyes, but I walked past them without a word. They had come uninvited, and I had no desire for reconciliation. Their betrayals shaped me into someone who refused to forgive. Driving home that evening, diploma beside me, I felt I had taken back my power. They had stolen my money, but I seized my future in return. That was revenge enough. I made a phone call that night, telling them never to contact me. My freedom felt real.